Yo, what is up, everybody? My name is Jay, and today I am going to do something a little different. I'm going to be doing a little, I guess you can call it theory crafting, but if anything, it's just more. Hold up a second. Okay, so there we go. So today I am going to essentially be talking about what I think could potentially happen with the next mainline Resident Evil 9 game. So, a few things. I am specifically talking about Resident Evil 9, not possibly, remakes. I'm not talking about remakes. Uh, as for 9, and fuck! Resident Evil 9 exclusively because 5 remake or Code of Veronica remake, they're going to happen eventually. But next mainline game, it's interesting because there's quite a few things that they could do with the next mainline game, especially if they decide to make the game take place directly after the events of Resident Evil 8, and more specifically, the Shadows of Rose DLC, which takes place like 16 years later into the mainline continuity. So today I'm going to be talking about 4 possible scenarios that I think could happen with Resident Evil 9. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So, scenario A for the plot of Resident Evil 9, I personally think that 9 is going to have Rose as the main protagonist in this game. And as for what she will do, I personally think it would be interesting for her to confront the connections, the organization that was essentially responsible for the events that took place in Resident Evil 7, which led to the events of, Ethan becoming a mold and, him and Mia going at it and then producing, Rose in 8. So it'd be interesting for Rose to essentially confront her indirect creators in a sense. And it'd also be interesting for her to once again confront Evelyn, or maybe even like a new perfected mold, enemy. And maybe somewhere along the line, maybe she will, have, or rather, what's the word I'm looking for? Achieve, her goal that she wanted in the Shadows of Rose DLC, her being rid of her powers, but still essentially maintaining her true self. So, why I personally want this to be a thing, if anything, because I think Rose has potential to be, not anywhere near as like, oh, a legacy character as like Chris, Leon, Jill, Claire, or anything like that. But it's interesting because she's the daughter of Ethan, who was made as a brand new character for the series for the 7th installment. And while his reception in that game was a little eh, people really grew to actually like him and even love him in 8, especially with him essentially sacrificing himself to protect his daughter, which everyone resonated with and loved. So it's interesting to fuck. So it was interesting to see, Ethan go from a mixed character in this series to one that fans, actively, praise as being, the world's best dad. And with the events that took place in the Shadows of Rose DLC, it'd be interesting to see Rose stand on her own, now more experienced and matured, especially with her being trained more underneath the guidance of Chris Redfield. Um, and they can do a few things with her character overall. Have a fuck. I keep fucking having goddamn derailments. Bottom line, Rose has the potential of being a more well developed character more than she was in the Shadows of Rose DLC, and her conflict with potentially confronting the connections, maybe even going up against the Blue Umbrella organization, because of like that whole subplot that was introduced in 8 with like the BSAA now sending out, bioweapons. So it'd be interesting to see what more they can do with, Rose, especially since, given the fact that she is a fresh, new, young character compared to, the legacy characters who are all at this point old as fuck. There's plenty they can do to make Rose, a standout and well likable character, going forward, being a young adult, being a more young adult compared to her teenage, age as she was in, Shadows of Rose. Another interesting thing they could do with the plot of Resident Evil 9, if they decide to make Rose the primary character, is have her be supported by a legacy character. Now, as I just mentioned, all the big name players, Chris, Jill, Leon, Claire, even Rebecca, they'd all be old as fuck. Like pushing past their 50s and even pushing past their 50s at this point. Now, granted, obviously, Chris Redfield, in 8, he was like in his 50s, it's no pushing, but now he'd be in his 60s. And with, every other character falling behind him also being that same age, yeah. However, they could also have it to where maybe a female character assists her, because Capcom a while back they said that like, oh yeah, like Jill, Claire, Rebecca, and even Ada, like, they're old, but they age much slower because of their numerous exposures to like different viruses. So like they can use that as like a justified reason for like, oh well, they're still around, in their 60s, helping out or assisting Rose. So they could probably do that. But I think it'd be more interesting if Sherry Birkin, who by the events of 2037 would actually be, yeah, she'd be 50, but it'd be interesting to see, how these two characters interact. Because in a way, they're both similar. Both are the offspring of individuals who have, in one way or another, been infected with something that was then kind of passed on to the other child. And they both operate in different ways, with Sherry's, virus inside of her, being more of a healing type, whereas with Rose's, mold abilities, being more destructive, if anything. So it'd be interesting to see how these two characters interact. And it'd be also interesting to see how Sherry, now much older, could fare, in the next mainline game if they actually decide to bring her along, bring her in. But more than likely, not gonna happen. But bottom line, I do think there is potential for Rose. Not only as like, oh, for like the overall plot of what RE9 could be, but primarily for just like her overall character. the idea of just like her being the daughter of, Ethan Winters, just a normal Joe, then turned into a mold who then essentially helped give birth to Rose, who has mold powers of her own, confronting her creators and putting a stop to them. It's interesting, and it adds more, especially since the connections, the organization that made the mold, they're still technically around. So, and another aspect is that Mia worked with the connections, and she worked with what is essentially the creation of Evelyn. So it'd be even more interesting to have these two characters, Rose and Evelyn, confront more. You know, Rose learning about her mother's involvement, learning about the events of Seven that took place. Like, it'd be interesting to see what Rose as a character could do if Capcom decides to go down scenario A route, having Rose be the primary character in the next mainline game. Scenario B, which is also very likely to happen, but basically it Resident Evil 9 would take place before or at least during the events of Resident Evil 7. So 7 takes place in the year 2017. That would actually roughly put the legacy characters at that point in time in their early to mid 40s. Sure, that still makes them, not exactly young, but for some of them to still be physically active enough, like Leon, even Chris, it could work. But I think it'd be more interesting to have the ninth installment, if they decide to go down this path, be led by, one of the female characters. And for me personally, I would love to see either Jill or, more preferably, Claire Redfield, make a major comeback to be the center main protagonist in a mainline installment. Because Claire's last major debut or game that wasn't the Resident Evil 2 remake was Revelations 2. But even if you don't count that, Code Veronica was essentially her game. And that came out forever ago, way back on the Dreamcast and PlayStation 2. But no, it'd be interesting to see, hey, during the events of 7, what else is happening in the world of Resident Evil? With, one of the legacy characters. What new assignment is Leon, doing? What made Chris, want to join, now a brand new Umbrella faction? Jill, being set free from, Wesker's mind control during the events of Resident Evil 5. It'd be interesting to see what every character up until, 7, it'd be interesting to see what all of them were doing. And I personally think that Claire Redfield should be given the spotlight for the ninth mainline installment if they decide to go, back to a different point in time. You know, why not make Resident Evil 9 with Claire Redfield take place between or maybe even after the events of, Resident Evil Infinite Darkness or after the events of Revelations? What's Claire going. Fuck. What is going on with Claire within the overall mainline continuity? At this point in time, we don't really know. So it'd be interesting to see her be given, the spotlight. because compared to every other character, you know, we can at least assume what's going on with them. Again, Jill, coming to terms, getting over her, imprisonment, imprisonment, yeah, that, from being, Wesker's slave, which was, something that was mentioned in Resident Evil Death Island. Um, like if they decide to have her as a character, maybe have like a psychological angle with Jill, with her still overcoming her, trauma, all that time being, his, personal, well, slave in a sense, having to go up against her, for her lifelong friend and all that stuff. Like, it'd be nice to see. In fact, why not have Rebecca? Oh, wait, that's right. Freaking Shinji Mikami doesn't like Rebecca. But regardless, Rebecca, she could be given the spotlight as her. Because, like, yeah, she's obviously, God, what the fuck does she do again? Like, bioengineering? Yeah, like she does something along those lines. I forget the proper term. But the point is, she's also capable as like someone who can kill zombies. Maybe something could happen while she's working at the organization that she's with. Maybe with her teaming up with a completely different character, or maybe even another legacy character. Maybe Rebecca could star in this mainline story, or better yet, Resident Evil 9 could do what Resident Evil 7 was originally going to be. And that was to have Leon and Sherry team up together. Yeah, that was for those of you who may not know, Resident Evil 7 was going to have Leon and Sherry, team up together before they decided to go back to the survival horror roots and give us the 7 that we know today. So it'd be interesting to see what they could do if they decide to go down the path of, make the game take place before or maybe even during the events of 7. Because again, at this point in time, in terms of relative age, all the characters would still be, active enough to be able to like ward off against an undead army and a bunch of other different bioweapons. And there's plenty of potential with each individual character that, yeah, like again, why exactly did Chris Redfield join, an Umbrella Corporation? How exactly is Jill holding up, psychologically from her time as Wesker's, slave? What's Claire going? What's going on with Claire? What more can like Rebecca do? Hell, make Sherry the next primary character. There's potential with her. Hell, why not bring back Sheva? Sheva's a freaking fan favorite. Like, it'd be interesting to see what can be done if they decide to, go back to a different point before Resident Evil 7. And I think scenario B is just as likely to happen as scenario A. So now for scenario C, honestly, I find this to be unlikely to happen. But it is something that can still happen. I just find it to be like the most unlikely. And that is a brand new character in a brand new story. Like, I just don't think it's going to happen because it already happened with Resident Evil 7. Because, like, we got a brand new character, Ethan Winters, in a brand new story, in a brand new setting with, completely different monsters, enemies, like it went in a completely different direction but was still ultimately connected to Resident Evil enough to be a mainline game. And it proved to be a success with, 7 and 8. So why they would do it again, like, I don't know. Like, I don't know. I just find it weird that, like, they make a brand new protagonist in a completely brand new story. Like, obviously, a brand new story is going to be a thing. But, like, if it ain't anything that's, like, connected to the events of, like, like, the overarching narrative of Resident Evil, or maybe even ties into the events of, like, 7 and 8, like, if it truly is something, like, different than what we already have with a completely different new protagonist, I mean, it could happen, but it already did. So why would they do it again? Now, to be fair, they could, obviously, like, oh, they'll make a brand new character that could be like, a prominent side character, or maybe even a secondary playable character later on in the story, because that's what, excuse me, that's what the Resident Evil games do, you know. But if the new character is going to be a secondary protagonist, a secondary playable character, then that means that they're going to have, an already established character be the main character. Like, yeah, obviously it's going to be a new story, but to have, the new game be led by a brand new, completely original character, I just don't think it's going to happen because it already did. So they'd essentially be redoing it all over again. Now, it's one thing if they, like, oh yeah, let's just take a character that nobody knows and let's make them the playable character. But then you'd be doing the scenario B where, hey, you know, you play as like an already established character in a game that takes place before or after, the events of 7. And if they decide to make the game take place after the events of 7 and 8, or at least 7, well then, you would still have a character who's over 40, and you'd have to choose from, like, all the characters that were, like, used in, like, Outbreak, or maybe even, God, what was his name? Billy from Zero. Like, he could be an interesting addition, bring him back. But it would then be, the scenario B, you know. So for scenario C, I mean, it can happen. I just don't see it happening because, well, again, 7 already did it. They introduced a brand new character in a completely brand new setting with brand new monsters that, in a way, differentiated itself from the main series, but still, maintained continuity within the series. So for them to do it again, like, they could, but with the amount of potential that, like, 9 has with, like, bringing back old characters, or, making Rose her own character, I just find that it's more likely going to be scenario A or B. But C could still happen. Unlikely to happen, but it could still technically happen, so who knows? So now, at this point, you're probably thinking to yourself, for the next mainline ninth game, it more than likely is going to come down between either the scenario A or scenario B. With C, likely to happen, but also unlikely to happen. However, there is one more thing, one more scenario that Capcom could do that could, in it of itself, combine every aspect of scenario A, B, and C and do something that no fan would ever see coming, but would also be welcome to. Elza Walker. Who is she exactly? Well, in short, Elza Walker was originally going to be the second protagonist in the original Resident Evil 2 before that version got scrapped and was later retooled into the Resident Evil 2 that we know that starred Claire Redfield. As for Elza Walker, the character herself, she would have been a 19-year-old college student motorcycle racer who, at the beginning of the zombie apocalypse happening in Raccoon City, would crash her motorcycle into the RPD. And in terms of anything else regarding her, that's really it. She was essentially prototype Claire Redfield, used as a secondary character in a unfinished and scrapped version of Resident Evil 2 that never really saw the light of day other than Resident Evil 1.5. But the fact of the matter is, Elza Walker. Capcom could make her an official character. And they could keep, her basic assets intact for the mainline series. Think about it. All of the major players, Chris, Jill, Leon, Claire, Ada, Sherry, hell, even Sheva, and plenty of other characters from before Resident Evil 7, they're old. They're all old. And yes, the female characters, Jill, Claire, Ada, them being exposed to like different viruses, slow down their aging and all that goody doo doo stuff. But wouldn't it be more interesting to see a fully realized, fully characterized Elza Walker be canonized in the Resident Evil series? And plus, it works fine whether they want to make her take place, make the scenario take place before or even after the events of Resident Evil 8, because she could still be, a young college student who is a motorcycle racer who gets wrapped up in some, bio weapon zombie apocalypse scenario that would make her, have to, pick up a gun and have to defend herself. It could echo back to the original Resident Evil 2 with, Claire having to defend herself in, a city that's overrun with zombies. But now, Claire's predecessor, in a sense, could take the main spotlight in a fully realized mainline canon story. What Elza Walker could have been characterized, we don't really know other than what little we know from 1.5. But yeah, Elza Walker, she could be that brand new character who is still at a, prime young age that could, in a sense, go forward if they do her right and carry the franchise just a little longer. And you could have her maybe, meet up with a legacy character. Imagine Elza Walker meeting Claire Redfield. Imagine their paths cross. She, Elsa Walker meeting the character who would essentially become, her successor. Like, that would be kind of cool, not only for like newcomers, but it'd be cool for like veterans who even got a chance to play Resident Evil 1.5 as Elsa and then Resident Evil 2 as Claire. There's plenty that can be done with Elsa if they decide to make her a fully realized canon character that could fit perfectly alongside the current timeline continuity of Resident Evil. In fact, I don't know who'd have even bigger potential, in my eyes. Rose Winters or Elsa Walker. I think Elsa would actually have more potential because, well, she's not a fully realized written character. But at the same time, like, it's a scenario that's more than likely never going to happen. It'd be crazy if Capcom decided to announce one day, oh yeah, Elsa Walker, she's gonna be, an actual character in like the next game or whatever. But it's more than likely never going to happen. But one can dream of the day Elsa Walker becomes a fully realized, canonized character in a mainline Resident Evil game. And that just about does it. Sorry for my yapping. I'm not 100% good at this stuff quite yet. More than likely never will. And I more than likely, in some regards, had maybe gotten some information twisted up a bit or even wrong. But my points still stand with what could essentially happen with, Resident Evil 9. And honestly, it'd be interesting to see whether I'm proven right or wrong. Because obviously, Resident Evil 5 or even Code Veronica remake, it's going to happen. It's going to happen one day. It's going to. But in terms of the next mainline installment, we don't really know what could happen. And that's the best part. We don't know. So there's near limitless potential possibilities with what could happen. So honestly, as long as the game is actually good and even maintains, the horror aspects, I'm going to be there for Resident Evil 9 when Capcom eventually announces it. But until then, thank y'all for watching and for